So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who's joining our webinar at the moment. We're going to wait for another 1 or 2 minutes just to ensure that we've got all the participants on board and ready to head into this next hour of the webinar. So if you just hold tight, and we'll start in a minute or so. See that we've got quite a few people have joined us already, but we'll just wait for another minute before we kick off. Looks like a healthy number of people have joined us now. So again, I'm just wishing everyone a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to our webinar today about PAS 96. And thank you very much for joining us. The purpose of today's webinar is to help you as food organisations understand the PAS 96 revisions that have been made in the 2026 version of PAS 96. To help, of course, strengthen your food defence mitigation and enhance resilience against any evolving threats that are coming to us as a food industry. I'm your host today. I'm Todd Redwood. I'm BSI's Global Managing Director for the consumer, retail and food sector. I've got over 30 years experience in the food industry, and it's my great pleasure to be hosting the webinar today. I'm going to introduce you to the panel in a minute, but I'd like you to just feel free to have a look onto the display that you're using today, interfacing with us today. And there's a question mark in the top right-hand corner, and in there you can place your questions. So if you've not lodged any questions prior to the webinar today, please feel free to use the question section to enter any questions in, and we'll attempt to get to those during the webinar. And of course, we'll address as many as we can at the end. So thank you very much. If we just now, we'll also be recording the session, and we'll share that recording via email with any participants today. And if we move to the next slide, please. I'll be very pleased to introduce our panel today. So we've got a great lineup of panel experts here. We have Leanne Singleton from Foodsure Food Safety. She's a food safety specialist based in Australia, and she was the technical author for PAS 96 2026. Leanne's got more than 20 years experience across the food supply network, specialising in implementing GFSI recognised standards for FSSC 22000 and BRCGS particularly, and she's been an instrumental person in getting this revision up and published. So thank you very much, Leanne, for joining us. Then we've got Natasha Vaughan. Natasha is the head of food supply chains and critical national infrastructure with the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or now will be called DEFRA in the webinar today. DEFRA was one of the sponsors of PAS 96 revision and has been instrumental in the PAS 96 evolving over the many years. I think this is the fifth revision of the standards. So great to have you on board today, Natasha. Our third panelist is Jason Bashura. Jason has been working for nearly 30 years in food protection, spanning state, local and federal public health in the US, as well as academia roles, and working to preserve and promote the public's health and well-being, and is now in the private sector. He's regularly connected for insights and all things food defence, and his knowledge of the subjects is outstanding. So thanks for joining us, Jason, today. And finally, Richard Leathers from Camden BRI, with 4 decades of food industry experience, specialising in HACCP, quality systems, auditing and risk assessment guidance. So expert panel, thanks very much for joining us. Now we'll just move into the agenda quickly before we launch into our first speaker. So today we'll cover the evolving threat environments and the evolution of PAS 96, the key changes that were made in this revision. We'll talk about where the risk is, then the cascading interdependencies that exist in our environment that we operate, the prioritisation of risk, mitigation measures, and then alignment with other publications and professionals within our fantastic industry. Again, just reminding you, if you've got any questions along the way, drop them into the questions section of the panel, the interface that we're using today. Just before we duck into the first speaker, we'd like to just use a poll here, one to check that you're alive and well, but also just to get a bit of feedback from you. So the first poll that we're doing today is asking, which of the following do you consider the greatest threats to food protection in your business? Is it intentional adulteration, or what we call food terrorism? Is it disruption of business, cybercrime? Or is it economically motivated adulteration? If you could drop your thoughts in there, and it'll just give us a bit of a sense and a flavour of who we're talking to or what your interests are. Good participation so far, thank you. And not too hard for you to press one of those buttons to just give us an indication of where your interests lie. It's probably enough time to give us a sense, just a bit of a temperature check. So if you can close that poll, that'd be great, and give us the results will pop up magically somewhere. I think.
Sorry, they flashed up but then left.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it looked like EMA, food fraud, was the leader, followed by cybercrime and then food terrorism.
Okay, great. As long as our speakers have got that information on board, then it's my pleasure to hand over the floor to Natasha, just to introduce us through the evolving threat environment and the revision itself. So thank you, Natasha, and we'll leave it to you.
So from a DEFRA perspective, the PAS 96 is becoming increasingly important because of the UK food system is operating in a more complex and uncertain threat environment. So if we look at the range of threats that the sector is facing now and how they continue to grow. So we could just flash up that first box. So there are traditional concerns around malicious contamination and food terrorism that remain relevant, but there are sort of a broad range of threat actors and motivations, such as organised criminal activity, that are also sort of increasing the seriousness of the threat landscape. And these sit alongside the risks on food terrorism and malicious contamination, alongside sort of increasing risks around insider threats that pose a particular challenge because individuals may possess both the knowledge and access needed to bypass controls. Whether motivated by ideology, grievance, coercion, or financial gain, trusted individuals can present a significant risk that often go undetected. So if we look now at the broader strategic environment that's also changing, so the food supply network itself. So climate-related impacts and geopolitical instability and pressures on global commodity markets can create shortages and price volatility. And those conditions can create incentives for food fraud and economically motivated alteration, creating opportunities for criminal activity within supply chains. And the volatility that we see and instability that we see increasing means that those opportunities are more attractive, and we saw more criminal activity and economically motivated alteration within supply chains. So moving on to sort of emerging threats around cyber. And just to continue on actually on sort of the supply network itself, the diversity of the food sector is both its strength and its potential vulnerability. The sector contains businesses of different sizes, functions, and levels of maturity, all operating within that complex environment that we were talking about. And so it's essential that food defence and food protection are embedded across that whole network, rather than being viewed as issues for individual organisations alone, which is why I think the guidance of PAS 96 is so important, because it can be accessed by food businesses of any size. So looking at on sort of the more emerging side of threats, although recognising that cybercrime and cyber threats have been around for a good number of years now, but they continue to grow in both frequency and sophistication. Food businesses are increasingly dependent on digital infrastructure now for production, logistics, inventory management, and communications. So disruptions to these systems can affect business continuity, reduce supply chain resilience, and create opportunities for malicious activity elsewhere in the network. And we know that the consequences of a successful attack can extend far beyond a single business. Food incidents can impact public health, undermine consumer confidence, damage the reputation of the wider sector, and lead to significant economic losses. And attacks on even a single business can have wide-ranging impacts for the supply chains they're involved in. So in an interconnected food system, disruption at one point in the network can quickly have consequences elsewhere. This makes the food sector an attractive target in terms of for those looking to cause disruption. And I think the value of PAS 96 is that it offers a practical and proportionate and accessible framework that can be applied to businesses of all sizes. So through the threat assessment critical control points approach, organisations can systematically identify threats, assess vulnerabilities, and implement measures to strengthen resilience in an environment where threats are becoming more diverse, more interconnected, and dynamic. So it helps turn sort of awareness of those different components of the threat environment into action that supports a resilient UK food sector. Move to the next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a bit as well about how the PAS has evolved over the past decades. So in 2008, the first edition of the PAS 96 emerged in response to growing concerns about deliberate contamination of the food supply. And so it focused primarily on protecting businesses from intentional attacks, particularly those motivated by ideological, political, or malicious intent. The approach was largely centred on physical security controls, personnel security, access management, supply chain oversight, and basic risk management techniques. And at this stage, the emphasis was on preventing intentional contamination rather than addressing sort of wider issues that might be impacting the food sector. And then in 2010, 2011, the second edition reflected a broader understanding of threats facing the food sector. So while concerns about terrorism and activist-driven attacks remained prominent, the guidance recognised that malicious actions could arise from a wide range of actors and motivations, including disgruntled former employees, criminals, and other insiders. Threat assessment critical control point concepts were developed into a more structured and systemic assessment approach, moving organisations away from the more reactive security measures toward proactive evaluation of vulnerabilities. And so that was an important shift from focusing solely on threats to looking at organisational vulnerabilities at the same time. And so in 2014 and 2017, in the 2014 edition, I think this is sort of widely regarded as the point at when the threat assessment critical control point became fully established as a core methodology of PAS 96. And so rather than viewing food defence as a collection of security measures, it provided a defined framework for assessment of that threat. We also saw the recognition of economically motivated adulteration in these versions, and this reflected lessons learned from sort of major incidents around that time, including like the horse meat scandal in 2013. So the PAS 96 tries as much as possible to take in the context of what's going on in the world right now, and making sure that this guidance is remains timely and sort of applicable. And in 2017, the threat landscape had evolved considerably, and so there was stronger consideration of cybercrime, recognising attacks on information systems, product controls, and logistical platforms could undermine food protection objectives. It also we started to introduce practical case studies to help organisations understand how real incidents occur and how weaknesses can develop within complex supply chain. So how have we kept what was great about the previous versions of PAS and updated it for this 2026 version? So I think we've moved towards a broader concept of food protection in this PAS. So the focus has gone beyond food defence more to that broader concept of food protection, recognising the interconnected nature of the threats in the food system. So there's more in this version around risk-based thinking and aligning food protection more closely with other management system approaches. TACCP is embedded within a plan, do, check, act cycle, so we're promoting continual improvement rather than periodic assessments. And the guidance reflects a more global and network-oriented food system, acknowledging the complex international supply chains and dependencies. So there's still a lot in the PAS around emerging threats, such as cyber incidents, misinformation, insider threats, organised criminal activity. But in that whole concept around embedding food protection as part of business as usual approaches. So I think if we move on to the next slide now.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you so much for that overview. And look, it's hard to believe that TACCP was actually born in the 2014 standard, so it makes TACCP 12 years old now. Now, I just wanted to share with you all some key changes in terminology. There's loads of changes in terminology in this PAS, but there's 4 that I just want to call out. So the first one is around food protection. So as Natasha just mentioned then, in the TACCP, is the PAS 96 2026 version, we've taken a more holistic view of food defence. So the first key change in terminology is we start talking about food protection, where that's the integrated practice of safeguarding the global food system. It's broader application than just food defence. So it also includes interrelated principles of food safety, food quality, physical infrastructure, OT, IT, etc. We've also used the word food terrorism in recognition that this aligns with current industry terminology. So food terrorism has been used to describe all of the incidents that we're referring to around malicious contamination. It distinguishes it from EMA, or economically motivated food fraud. The third one is cybercrime. That's not a new terminology. It's been in previous versions, but we've refined the definition. So the definition there looks at nefarious cyber, IT, OT activities that could result in adulterated food, in addition to business disruption, which is one of the key motivations for cybercrime. And then lastly, we have swapped out food supply chains for food supply networks. This is in recognition of the complexity of non-linear products and processes. This is a really important update to the PAS. We've also updated the figure for supply networks, and it's important because we're showing the interconnected relationships across the broader supply ecosystem that we have, and obviously the vulnerabilities that are often harder to detect or control because they involve multiple parties and often third parties. I'm going to hand over to Richard now, who's going to talk about some real-world events.
Okay, thank you, Leanne. And first of all, thank you doubly, not only for handing over to me, but being a fantastic technical author. And I know there's been times when myself in the UK, I've had it easy because Leanne has been very late at night on a triangular call with myself and Jason, who's had it very early in the morning in the US. So, you know, thanks to both of those guys going through technical information in detail. So looking at some specific examples then, some of these you may be aware of, some of these you may not be, but I think that's something that we've tried to put in and contextualized in this new iteration of the PAS. JBS, a meat giant, cyber activity. We've seen this also in the UK with a snack company where a cyber activist will you know, they can hit so many parts of an organization. It can be intake, it can be storage, it can be putting in orders just by taking down the cyber system. And it becomes almost like a house of cards, and everything just collapses in on itself. The Malathion one in Japan, the attack here was against the firm, not the public, and that could have been significantly worse than it was in terms of harm. And the bottom one gained a lot of traction in the news. 6 people died in Laos from drinking tainted alcohol, and you know, it was actually tainted with methanol. And you know, this is horrendous, and this happens far too often. You know, it's happened before, it's going to happen again, and this is what we need to take heed of in the food industry. And these are some absolute real world examples. So yeah, thank you very much, and you'll hear from me again in a little while.
Thank you, Richard. Richard has just mentioned the cascading interdependencies, and we've tried to allude to this throughout the PAS 96. So we've looked at risk amplification, where targeted acts can have a high impact due to the interconnected supply networks. We also look at the assessment focus, where there's an opportunity to use the newly aligned TACCP with the PDA cycle to look at second and third orders. So what is the impact if something happens to my supplier or my supplier's supplier? And then we look at proportionate controls and the absolute need for cross-functional teams to help us determine, for the vulnerabilities we have, what are the most appropriate and proportionate mitigation measures across the business. Next, thanks. So key changes to PAS 96, and I'm going to cover this off quickly because I really want to get on to the next part of the presentation where Jason's going to break down the differences between risk, threats and vulnerabilities. So the first is, as Natasha has already alluded to, there are updates to the threat environment. So the scope of PAS 96 has been updated. We now have 3 specific areas of scope. They look at intentional adulteration, inclusive of food terrorism. They look at cybercrime, and they look at EMA. We've had a major change in the structure and presentation. So if you haven't downloaded the guide yet, please do so. It looks very different. We've revised figures for the TACCP process, the food supply network, and also the risk assessment scoring has had a significant upgrading to include both human health and to look at business, financial and reputational damage. We've added a whole lot of checklists, which we'll talk to later, which are practical self-assessment tools that you can use in your own business and modify to suit your particular products and processes. And we also have recognition of many other approaches that are out there that you might like to further explore. And then for the TACCP approach, as I mentioned, it has now been aligned with the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. This was in response to feedback we had about people saying that they felt it was time for the TACCP process to be more systematic and more systems-based and to integrate with other types of management systems. There's clearer guidance on how to apply TACCP. And most importantly, this is what I'm really excited about. We have improved distinction between risk, threats, and vulnerabilities. Over to Jason.
Leanne, you're going to have a hard time getting to sleep tonight. I know it's like 11 o'clock where you are, so thanks for your enthusiasm. I do want to echo Richard's comments as well, and thanks to Leanne and the BSI team for the great work in the project behind the scenes. So I'm going to see if I can interact here with the audience a little bit using your react buttons if you've got a pothole like this in your community nearby. I was driving through Europe last summer, and I didn't see a damn one, okay? But I could drive 5 miles from my house and see 10 of these. So let me see some of those reactions. Thumbs ups, thumbs downs. Yeah, so you all know what I'm talking about. So I'm a visual learner, and when I think about images and using images to help teach and to help folks to understand what we're talking about, the reality is that pothole is a threat. And what is my risk? My risk could be a flat tire. I could have a blowout. I could have an accident if I hit that thing. But the vulnerability, where is my vulnerability to that pothole? Am I riding a bike? Am I riding a motorcycle? Am I in a Maserati going 185? I mean, there's a lot of different ways to assess me and my vulnerability to that threat, that pothole. But where's the risk? So if I'm tooling down the street and there happens to be a traffic cone, for example, in the middle of the street, I might see it. All right, so the vulnerability is me. But if the traffic cone is showing me where that threat is, I could stay clear of it. Or what if there was a sign, you know, a half mile or just shortly before that instance or before I arrive at the pothole, I could slow down, I could move to the side. Or if I'm using my favorite navigational app, right, it's telling me road hazard ahead. So it's coming. So we hear those words used interchangeably, but they're not the same. Risk is the result of a threat exploiting that vulnerability. And until we as an industry fully embrace that, there might be perceptions of risk where there might be a threat that we're not vulnerable that leads to perceptions of risk that simply don't exist. So I'll challenge you all to look at it through that lens of, you know, me as the vulnerability, the threat is the external, and the risk as it all comes together. And as we continue down that road, if you would advance to the next slide, Reese, that'd be great. Just in summary, an overview of what I had just shared. The pothole's the threat, the tire is the vulnerability, the flat tire, the blowout, the accident is the risk. That's what we're trying to avoid. And there are a variety of mitigations, like the real corny, cheesy animations that I threw in there today. Thanks for your help with the animations, Reese. But those mitigations help to reduce the risk either by protecting the vulnerability or eliminating the threat. So think about that in the work that we do every day and understand that risk, threat, and vulnerability are used interchangeably, but they're not all the same thing. Richard, over to you.
Hi, thanks, buddy. And another analogy I like to say is, you know, people say to me, "Oh, we're all in the same boat." No, we're not in the same boat. We might all be in the same storm, but if you're in a rowboat, that's very different than if you're in a cruise liner. And you know, your Maserati and a motorbike, and you're in a 16-wheel truck. It's exactly that example. So what I'm talking here about is, and I was really pleased to be involved in the PASS in 2014, 17, and 26. And there was a lot of input in 14 after the horse meat adulteration into beef from Chris Elliott, and he came up with his 8 pillars in the Elliott Review. And I said to Chris, I said, well, you know, which is the one that we've really got to focus on? And he said, you take all of them or you take none. And that's like with these mitigations, you know, there's no point putting a really good gate, but there's no fence either side of it, because all the cattle's just going to go through either side of the gate. So talking about gate, having physical access controls, you know, swipe cards and things like that. Process and engineering, could there be variances where we do inline tests? Use of technology, you know, we've got to embrace and enhance this technology so that it can help us and not hinder us. Product specific tamper evidence, you know, if the stuff gets in there, can you see that it's been put in there? And then procedural or behavioral aspects, and you know, one of the big buzzwords in the food industry now is the culture. Have people got that culture of challenge? Do people know what good looks like and what bad looks like in terms of food defense? Have they the ability, the perspicacity, and the confidence to hit that red button? And on to the next speaker.
That was pretty casual, Richard. Thanks for the handoff. I'm super excited and very pleased to present for the first time publicly an effort that was created by the as-is food defense and ag security community a couple of years ago. It went through several iterations. You see the date down below in the bottom right there. But in working with the Food Defense Consortium, as well as the AFTO Food Defense Committee, we were pulling together an infographic to help identify what mitigation measures might be applicable across the spectrum, looking at the industry from left to right, from reception to distribution and everywhere in between. And each one of those bulleted items within the color-coded box below helps to think about where are there issues that we could mitigate, or what are some of those vulnerabilities that might need to be secured or mitigated. So we've created the slide for physical security measures. And thanks to Andy Griffiths and Frank, I know you guys are on the call. Appreciate you guys joining and you're helping out. But at the same time, looking forward and how do we bring it to the current? So I reached out to the as-is team a couple weeks ago. I said, let's build one for cyber. So if you could advance to the next slide, cyber IT and OT, Reese, that'd be great. And I reached out to a good buddy of mine, Joe Weiss, and he's getting some credit there on the bottom left, but helped me to look at where are those IT and OT things that maybe we see every day, we think about every day, but we don't realize the impact of what they could have on the process, on the network, as we're describing. So again, the resources will be made available for you to look at in more detail offline, or if you want to reach out through the BSI team, I'd be glad to chat or explain in further detail. But as you think through what we're sharing here today, the network it's interconnected, as Leanne had explained, those cascading interdependencies. It's like the blood supply, you know, after an accident or in times of trouble, you know, the blood supply, you know, giving blood, donating blood helps to keep everyone going. And so I would encourage you, if you have the opportunity to do so, to donate blood as it relates to connecting and cascading and mitigating risks across our food supply network. And I'm going to kick it back over to Leanne. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. And I love the way that we're building on a theme here around interconnectedness. So in that view, we've had a bunch of self-assessment tools. So we've moved all of the checklist prompts out of the text and we've put them in annexes in the new PAS. So the great thing about these is these are just thought promoters. These are just prompts for you. You can take these, you can copy them out of the PAS, drop them into your own document. We have an annex for assessing the threat environment, and we look at multiple different types types of threats that you could assess as being relevant to your business, to your operation, your products and your processes. And then we also have some checklists looking at identifying your vulnerabilities. So knowing now that we know there's a very clear difference between a threat and a vulnerability, which is going to give us the risk. So do have a look at those annexes and take them and make those your own, customize them to suit you. Todd.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Leanne. And we're just going to move on now very quickly to a second poll. And we'd like to ask you, which area of PAS 96 do you think will require the most attention for you in your organisation? So a couple of choices here: the threat identification and vulnerability assessment, implementing mitigation measures, incident response planning, or cybersecurity, the IT and OT piece. If we can get your very quick thoughts on that, that'd be great, and then we can continue on through the rest of the webinar. Just addressing a couple of questions as we go there as well. Yes, the webinar materials will be shared as part of the recording, so pleased to be able to share that with you. So I think it's time that we can close the poll and have a look at those results. So overwhelmingly, it was threat identification and vulnerability assessment as coming in number one. Number two was the implementing mitigation measures, then cybersecurity, and finally incident response planning. So great, thank you very much. Now handing back to Leanne.
Thank you, Todd. And look, I don't think it's a surprise that the number one concern for people is threat identification and vulnerability assessment, because we're dealing with a bunch of unknowns, aren't we? And in Richard's words, you don't take one, you take them all. And I understand why there's perhaps more anxiety about that. Once we know what the risks are that we need to manage, it's easier for us to determine what those mitigation measures might be. I'm not going to go through every aspect of the TACCP alignment with the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, but let's have a look at an overview as to what this is. It is explained over several pages in the new PAS 96. So the first step is obviously plan. This is the part in the process where we identify and we prioritize risk. And this is broken down into a number of steps. For those of you familiar with previous PAS documents, you might say you can see where some of this alignment has taken place. We've tried to use as many of the previous steps to put them nicely into this PDCA cycle. So planning, assessing new information, getting your team together, looking at your vulnerabilities in your system to help you identify risk. And by identifying your risk, you'll then know what type of potential mitigation measures might work. Moving on to the do in the cycle. This is where we implement the mitigation measures. We provide the training so that people can effectively implement those mitigation measures and support our food protection and food defence plan. We also look at how we might determine our incident response protocol. Moving on to check. This is where we evaluate the effectiveness of the mitigation measures that we've put in place. So where we can challenge mitigation measures, also where we can analyse, we can look at near-miss incidents, actual incidents, and assess new threat information that's particular to our business. And lastly, act is where we can drive continuous improvement. So that is the bigger picture, the broader horizon scanning, strengthening our mitigation measures, reassessing our controls for supply network partners, and providing ongoing training. So training and culture, as Richard said, are really critical to supporting a food protection and a food defence system. I'm going to hand it over to Richard, who's going to talk to us about food terrorism incidents and cyber attacks and what that response can look like.
Fantastic, and one of the things I'm really proud of my involvement with this opportunity was this Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. It's a known method. And it really does work, not just in food defense, but in life. If you can think about things in that plan, that do, that check, that act cycle, then it helps out in everything. So let's look at the first box that we've got there then, Reese, if you can click through. So planning for our emergency response, getting the appropriate team. Now, you might say, well, this is easy for a big organization. You've got 10, 12, however many people, 5 people to put in that team. Yeah, okay, I get that. But even if you're a small or medium enterprise, think multidisciplined. Even if it's one person thinking, right, what about engineering? What about new product development? What about supply networks? And thinking about things from that different aspect. You might have 2 or 3 people in that team to bounce off it rather than the 10 or however many. But think about multidisciplined and think about the communication and making sure that everyone is aware and conscious of that detail. Assessing new information. I'm going to quote from Donald Rumsfeld here. There are known knowns, there are known unknowns, but there are unknown unknowns, and that was if we don't know about it, we can't assess it, we can't bring it into our portfolio. So that's really what we've got to do is don't have our ivory tower of thinking that we're just wonderful all the time. With our HACCP system, we know when we launch a new product. We know when we put a new production line in there. We know when we are doing building work. We don't with our supply networks. And that's another thing I'm really proud of, is it is a network rather than a chain. I've got a boat a couple of miles down the river here, and that's got an anchor with a chain on it. And a chain is really linear, and it's got very strong links, because when you need it, you absolutely need it. Our supplies do not come from a chain. Think about a map of the London Underground superimposed on a map of the Paris Metro, superimposed on a map of the New York subway. That's what we're dealing with. Agents, traders, brokers. You're not telling me that something's not going wrong somewhere in that network, and you need to capture it and you need to bring it into your system. And consider the impact, because it's unique for you. If we move on to the next animation. So business continuity, implement appropriate mitigation measures for you. Assessing, well, where do we sit? Is that going to be big for us? Is it not going to be big? And it's a bit Pareto analysis. It's 80-20, isn't it? 80% of the problems are going to come from 20% of the things. So, work out what's big for you rather than what might be big for somebody else. The important one there is the middle one. Evaluating, monitoring, analyzing, challenging. Don't think it's going to work just because some clever people thought it's going to work. What are your marks and measures? What are your KPIs on this? And then strengthen and reassess. Has it done what we expect it to do? And the last one, these are taken directly from the PASS. So this is from section 9.2. The others are from section 6.2, 6.3, and 6.3.6.6.4. So this one is from 9.2. And we all think that we've got a great crisis manual plan until we actually need to use it. And then it all turns into ashes and dust in our hands. So minimize the threats, collaborate, maintain public confidence, reduce reputational, prevent recall, all of those things, but from a food defense perspective, and make it personal for you. Okay, moving on. Okay, so I'm probably the worst person in the world, because I'm 100 years old, to talk about incidents of cyber management, because I am the dinosaur. But in a way, I'm the best person, because I can poke a stick into an ant's nest and say, why is that like that? So if we start through the animations, how big is cyber? So for the year ending March 22, in the UK, the Office for National Statistics reported 4.5 million fraud offences, of which 61% were cyber related. This is massive. So any vulnerabilities that can arise from systems, devices, technologies, and if you've not got up-to-date patches, these can be compromised. Moving on, you need a cyber specialist. Now, that might be in-house. It might be some expertise that you've got to get in from outside. But they need to be familiar with the systems and the mitigations. Again, that word mitigations. And your mitigations need to be appropriate and proportionate. And then the last box, if something does happen, respond quickly, because that will massively affect your ability to get back on your feet again after an attack. And every single day, I guarantee every single day, there's companies within the food industry and outside the food industry that are being hacked and are being taken down through cyber incidents and issues. Okay, thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you, Richard. Third poll and the final poll for today is asking you, what's your biggest challenge to implementing or maintaining effective food defense? Is it maintaining awareness of evolving threat environments? Is it about staff awareness and training? Integration with existing systems, for example, your TACCP system, or is it the supplier and contractor management aspects? If you could just pop your thoughts into the poll quickly, that'd be great. See, we're getting lots of responses through. More than half of you have voted now, so that's great. We've ended. And so we've got a result of, the top score was maintaining an awareness of evolving threat environments, then followed by supplier and contractor management, and then staff awareness and training, and finally integration with existing systems. So thank you. And now moving over back to Jason.
Thanks a bunch, Todd, and thanks for folks participating in the polls. What we're attempting to depict in this slide here is showing the connection and the relationship, the network across the system of various standards or guides, expectations, requirements, regulations that talk about food defense. And when we speak of food protection within the PAS, how can we help to provide that umbrella under which we could identify whether an issue is a hazard versus a threat culminating in risk? And there were a couple of questions in the questions that have been submitted. So thank you so very much. And I believe your question was about integration of the PAS into various other documents and such. And the plan is, like I believe Natasha mentioned earlier, I think Leanne actually said how TACCP, the concept of TACCP was born out of the PAS in 2014. So as we're working together, leading from behind, if you would, within this effort, and again, thanks to Natasha and the sponsors of the updates to the PAS 96, the terminology that's being used, how do we align, how do we simplify, how do we make sure what we're saying is accurate and it's technically correct and it relates to what it is that we're attempting to address. Looking at FSSE 22000, there's some edits and updates going on at present. I am aware of an update that was attempted by the World Health Organization a few years ago. My buddy, Dr. Sehun down in Australia was working with the World Health Organization, and the project fell through. But I'm hoping to be able to leverage our experience within the PAS to help inform a future iteration of this document, and perhaps looking at some gaps that might be present from 2008 with the last iteration of that document that had come out. And finally, I wanted to draw the attention of our participants here today about the Dalziel record, which I refer to as very foundational to our food defense work, where Dr. Dalziel had evaluated more than 50 years worth of incidents and what had occurred relative to intentional acts of adulteration, as he'd referred to as food defense incidents. But as I always say, a food defense incident isn't a thing. Food terrorism and intentional act for harm is a thing. Food defense is what we do to mitigate that risk. So Dr. Dalziel's report is, like I said, foundational. If you've not seen it, I would encourage you to do so. But 98% of those incidents occur at the retail interface, where the consumer is closest to the food supply. So think about your risks and what you do and how you're able to protect the public's health and well-being, your consumers, whether it's an individual family having dinner tonight or selling off to the next component in that food supply network. Some things to keep in mind. So, Anne, thank you for your question, and we'll hope to get the rest of the questions if we could before we run out of time here today. So, Reese, if you could advance to the next slide. Just a couple of anecdotal feedback that we've received in the last few weeks, maybe month or so, with the PAS release in late March. And Pankaj talked about a proactive approach within TACCP and how it's been clearly identified within the PAS 96. And my friend Kristen King, thanks for your support, as always, from our cyber ITO team perspectives. And her comment was simply, woohoo. So, Kristen, thank you for that. If you could advance to the next slide. Reese, thank you so very much. Farzana's comment was about, again, a proactive food defense approach within the PAS 96. And then I'd mentioned Frank earlier from the ASIS Food Defense and Ag Security community, as well as the Food Defense Consortium, talking about that differentiation, the dichotomy between what is food defense and what is food fraud, thinking about food authenticity and reducing the risk of intentional adulteration for economic gain. So just some takeaways for you all to think about. And as it relates to your network, we talk about the food supply network. You all need to think about your networks and growing your networks. And I see Vanessa, my buddy from the Georgia Department of Agriculture, is on the line, helping to connect those dots, learning from each other, sharing what you've taken away, perhaps sharing information about this webinar to be able to build your network to help strengthen and protect the food supply. So Leanne, over to you.
Thank you, Jason. And look, obviously, we were delighted to see this feedback coming through from food industry professionals. From the Australian perspective, Karen Constable from the Rotten Apple also said PAS 96 just got a major glow up. This means a lot to us, and I'd like to also thank the steering committee. It is truly being a multi-nation effort to pull this version together. Have a look at them. They're listed in the forward for the guide. Key takeaways for you. Food protection is fundamentally, it's a mindset rather than a rigid checklist-driven system of prevention and regulatory compliance. When we sat down and we said, what needs to be on the checklist that we're putting in the annexes, we realized very quickly we would never create a checklist to cover every scenario. So it's really important that people think about the mindset more so than what do I need to do to show that I've assessed this for an audit? What do I need to do to make sure I don't get a non-conformance in my audit? It goes so far beyond audit compliance. Please be mindful, for all of you out there working in this field, we do have a continually evolving threat environment, and there's sophisticated tactics being employed by threat actors. I think we felt that when we were putting the information, particularly around cybercrime, that no sooner do we publish the guide than it's potentially out of date because things are moving so quickly. And I'm sure that use of AI-driven technology is going to be a space to watch when we start looking at how that could be used against us to damage food protection. We also want you to be mindful of the dynamic interplay between threats and vulnerabilities that together create real-world risks. So just wrapping up what Jason said, as a pivotal industry guide, PAS 96 both influences and informs other guidance documents. However, we also need you to contribute to this process. So we will be getting feedback from this. Thank you. Todd.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Leanne, and thanks to all the speakers. So we're coming to the close of the webinar here, just going through a few of the mechanical and administrative things here, but how do you get your hands on this fantastic version of PAS 96? Well, it's free to download, so please just go in, if there's a little bit of information missing here, but if you can search for the BSI PAS 96 2026 into your search engine, and then provide your email address in there, you'll be able to download that for free. Thank you so much to our steering committee members for all their inputs, of course, and all the other contributors. If you have a look in the PAS itself, you'll see in the forward that everyone that was contributing is listed there. And that takes us through to question and answer time. We've got a little bit of time to go through some of these. So I've got a question here that I've seen. and I guess we can pick up all the panelists here and see who wants to put their hand up and answer this. What are your thoughts on fraud and malicious contamination being considered as hazards in TACCP as required by many standards? The person who's asked this said, my thoughts, these are intentional causes and not hazards. If they happen, they may result in physical, chemical, allergen or micro hazards. Anyone want to pop their hand up about that one? Might have had a pre-read in the questions. Jason.
I think they're almost synonymous, one and the same. A threat and a hazard are both external forces. You know, the vulnerability is where we might be weak or vulnerable to that threat or that hazard. But we think about in law enforcement, and as I've learned in my 30 years of experience, you know, we talk about specimens for public health and evidence for crime. So what is the relationship between a hazard and a threat? I think it's in the eyes of the beholder, and what are we talking about? So a threat, very simply, could be the hazard. Think about that pothole in the middle of the road, depends on what the context that it's being used. Defer to any of the other panelists for perspective.
Yeah, and I can add to that. If you look at you know, the TACCP and the Codex philosophy, it's all about significant hazards. So, you know, the vulnerability might be this table. It might be a real wobbly table and the screws have been put on. And I didn't put it together very well. But the threat, and this is why it's proportionate to everybody, is a big fat bald 100-year-old person sitting on top of it or dancing on the table. That's going to you know, exacerbate the threat, isn't it? So at that point, the table drops and what have you. Or if I decide to pick up the table and drag it along the floor, that's going to make the table collapse. So it's about significance. It's about the significance of what it is. And yeah, it will impact into the TACCP study, but you've got to assess the impact and severity.
Richard, you know this is being recorded. I love that very simple and succinct explanation. Yes, sir. Thank you
very much.
Yeah, please don't try this at home, ladies and gentlemen. So thanks, Richard and Jason, for those answers there. Another question is coming. Do we have editable templates available from some of the examples in the PAS?
Yeah, one thing that Leanne pulled out really well was the checklist, and we spent a lot of time on the checklist. Take from them what you will, and use them. They are fantastic checklists. I would say that because I helped to contribute to them. But you know, it is proportionate to you. Some of the questions might not be relevant. Some of the questions you might think, well, we've got that, but ask the questions anyway. Don't just assume that because you've got a system, it's working and it's wonderful. So, you know, challenge yourself with those checklists that are in the annexes.
Yeah, and the checklist, I would agree as a starting point. There could be questions that are missing that you want to add, that you want to consider, that are specific and germane to your aspect of the network as well. So not all questions apply, and they might not all be included. So, hey, help us make it better with the next iteration.
Great. Now, there's a question we might not be able to answer here, but someone's asked, how will the PAS be incorporated into BRCGS food safety? That sounds like a question for BRCGS.
Well, it is, and I have to acknowledge here that that's another committee that I sit on. I don't actually do any work. I just sit on committees. So we're currently working on version 10. And it's not at the next meeting, it's the meeting after that. We're getting on to section 5. There have been a lot of comments on public consultation in 5.4, because that's where the fraud bits comes, and in 4.2 that's where the food defense piece comes. Now clearly we have to take on board, from that committee's perspective, what's the output of this committee. So whilst we can't write a standard, for those of us that write standards, that has a shelf life and is dated, we clearly have to take into account current methodologies and current attitudes, and this is a current methodology and a current attitude. So
yeah, Richard, if I could just jump in, it's the alignment, it's the terminology, it's the application, and saying what we mean and meaning what we say. So if we are able to use the PAS as, again, that foundation, that building, to make adjustments vertically, then so be it. All we're trying to do is coalesce and make sure that we're all saying the same thing. I've worked with Dr. Spink, Michigan State, food fraud phenom, you know, known globally for his work. But, you know, we've talked about the need for harmonizing terminology. And if we could use this effort as a step in that direction, then thanks so much to the sponsors, Natasha and Defra, for helping us with putting our neck out there, taking a step forward and building that future momentum.
Terrific. And it's not true, Richard, that all you do is sit on committees, because you also dance on tables. Now, another question has come up. There seems to be quite a bit of interest from people about, and this is probably going to give people heart palpitations on the committee. If there's future edits or updates, how can people get involved in the process? I'm sure that no one wants to dive into a revision right now, probably mostly DEFRA as well, but how do we get involved is a question.
I think reaching out through the BSI team that coordinated this fantastic webinar, and thanks Jess and Reese behind the scenes for pulling this together. You know, hey, I've already got a list of things I've been sharing with Leanne and thinking about for what comes next. I mentioned the what if mentality earlier. What if we could, and so reach out through the webinar, the organizers here. I'm not sure, Jess or Reese, if you guys want to put contact in the chat box, not to throw you under the bus, but again, thank you so very much.
Great. Okay, well, I think it really does, it brings us to the end. We're right on time. Thanks so much, everyone, for participating today. Thanks for our expert panelists. And of course, as we mentioned at the beginning and throughout, the slides and the presentation will be shared with you if you've registered for the webinar. So look out for that in your inbox. And for wherever you are in the world, have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for what you do every day.